The ripple of unease that followed the arrival of the letters did not fade once the moment passed. Rather, it spread gradually, like ink bleeding through linen. Conversations that ought to have turned back to sponge cakes and weather forecasts instead looped nervously around the same topic. What had been written, who might have written it, and what, if anything, should be done. Miss Marple observed it all from her shaded seat beneath the sycamore, her pale eyes thoughtful, though her hands remained politely folded, as if she were merely waiting for the tea to be served. No one noticed her gaze lingering on the faint tremble in Mrs. Farnham's fingers, or on the way Mr. Pritchard had placed his letter face down on the tablecloth, as though the mere sight of it unsettled him. The party struggled on for several minutes with an air of forced joviality. Mr. Carroway resumed chatting with Mrs. Danforth about violin selections, though his eyes flicked now and again toward Alice Farnham, who stood near the archway twisting her gloves in her hands. Mrs. Blackwell, meanwhile, drifted from group to group, her tone hushed but pointed, attempting unsuccessfully to pry out the contents of the letters. Miss Marple noticed how certain guests gravitated toward the afflicted pair with concern, while others kept a wary, almost guilty distance. None of it surprised her. Poison pen letters had a peculiar effect on people. They brought out hidden loyalties and even more hidden fears. Miss Marple eventually rose from her seat, offering Mrs. Farnham a gentle smile and a light touch on the arm. "Perhaps, my dear, you would feel better with a moment indoors. Sometimes a little privacy can be a great comfort in unpleasant situations." Mrs. Farnham nodded stiffly, grateful for the excuse. Yes, you are quite right. Alice, will you come with me?" But Alice hesitated. She glanced toward Mr. Carroway, who tried quickly to appear uninterested, and murmured, "Aunt, I should stay and greet the remaining guests. I'll join you shortly." Something flickered briefly across Mrs. Farnham's face. Surprise, perhaps disappointment, but she made no comment. Miss Marple accompanied her toward the French doors leading into the drawing-room, offering her a steadying presence. Yet before they reached the threshold, Mr. Pritchard cleared his throat loudly. "If Mrs. Farnham is taking a moment, perhaps I should as well. This sort of thing, well, it takes one off guard, doesn't it?" Miss Marple paused, glancing back. The man's usual composure had slipped. His complexion carried a sheen of perspiration despite the mild weather, and he kept one hand pressed to his chest as if steadying himself. She inclined her head politely but observed him with quiet deliberation. People unfamiliar with wickedness sometimes responded with tears or bluster, but people who feared exposure often responded differently. More quietly, more nervously, as though calculating the implications. "Of course, Mr. Pritchard," Mrs. Farnham said distractedly. "Take whatever time you need." The two parted ways, Mrs. Farnham retreating indoors while Mr. Pritchard moved toward the side of the garden, away from the clusters of whispering guests. Miss Marple watched him disappear behind a hedge, noting the stiffness in his stride. Moments later, Philip Carroway approached Alice with a reassuring smile that did not reach his eyes. "Are you certain you're all right?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, though the word felt brittle. "It is only... my aunt has so many responsibilities. Something like this unsettles her terribly." Carroway lowered his voice. "It unsettles most people. Anonymous accusations rarely mean anything good." Alice's gaze flicked to the path where Mr. Pritchard had vanished. "Do you think—" He shook his head. "I think speculation will only make matters worse." Miss Marple, passing near enough to hear, made a soft sound, neither agreement nor dismissal, merely thoughtful. "Speculation is the natural response of human nature, Mr. Carroway, though it is rarely the most reliable one." Her tone was light, almost airy, as she moved along, leaving behind a faint ripple of discomfort in the young solicitor. The uneasy atmosphere thickened as the minutes slipped by. A few guests excused themselves early, murmuring about errands and prior engagements, though their glances toward the house suggested they feared more letters might arrive at any moment. Mrs. Danforth attempted to play her violin to restore the mood, but the somber notes only heightened the tension. Even the birds seemed quieter, as if they too sensed something amiss. When Alice finally excused herself to check on her aunt, Miss Marple quietly followed at a respectable distance. The drawing-room stood empty save for a teacup quivering faintly on a saucer, evidence of Mrs. Farnham's earlier agitation, but there was no sign of the woman herself. Alice called her name once, twice, her voice tightening with each repetition. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. "Let us look calmly, my dear. Panic never improves one's vision." They searched the adjoining rooms, sitting room, morning room, library, with no success. Through an open window, Miss Marple noticed the faint flutter of curtains disturbed by a passing breeze. She stepped closer. The window overlooked the narrow path that curved around the house toward the herb garden. "Perhaps she wished for air," Miss Marple murmured. Alice hurried ahead, skirts brushing the gravel as she rounded the corner. The herb garden lay dappled in sunlight, its lavender bushes nodding lazily in the warm breeze. But the peaceful scene was interrupted by a motionless form slumped against the low stone bench. For a heartbeat, Alice seemed unable to process the sight before her. Then a strangled cry escaped her throat. Miss Marple moved swiftly, more swiftly than most expected, of her, and knelt beside Mrs. Farnham. The woman's head lolled awkwardly, her skin strangely pale, her lips faintly discolored. The crushed letter, still clenched in her hand, fluttered slightly in the wind. Miss Marple touched her wrist with practiced delicacy. There was no pulse. Alice sank to her knees, trembling, her breath catching in shallow bursts. "Aunt Lavinia, oh please, what happened to her?" Miss Marple looked at the scene with quiet gravity, noting the unnatural stillness, the discoloration, the faint scent of something metallic and wrong lingering in the air. She did not speak immediately, for the truth, though only partially visible, was clear enough. "Fetch the rector," she said softly, "and the constable. I believe Mrs. Farnham has been poisoned." Alice's cry carried farther than she intended, and within moments footsteps echoed along the garden path, first hesitant, then urgent. Miss Marple remained kneeling beside the still form, her expression softened with sorrow, yet sharpened by that quiet alertness she never entirely relinquished. She did not touch the crushed letter again. One glance had been enough to imprint every detail into her memory. Instead, she observed the scene as it settled into its terrible stillness. The way the sunlight appeared too bright for such a moment, the faint rustle of lavender, the single overturned teacup lying near the bench as though it had slipped from trembling hands. Alice knelt beside her aunt, her breath quivering. "She was fine an hour ago," she whispered, as if pleading with time to reverse itself. "She only meant to rest." She just can't be." "Hush, my dear," Miss Marple murmured gently. "Shock is a cruel companion. It muddles the mind. But I fear your aunt has indeed passed." Before Alice could respond, Philip Carroway appeared at the entrance to the herb garden, slowing at the sight. His confident step faltered. "Good Lord," he breathed, moving closer but stopping several feet away. "Miss Marple, Alice, what has happened?" Alice lifted her tear-filled gaze. "She's dead, Philip. She must have fallen ill or something terrible." Miss Marple straightened slightly, her fingers resting on the cool stone bench for support as she rose. "It would be best not to move her," she said softly. "There are matters the constable must see exactly as they are." Carroway swallowed hard, looking from the bench to the scattered rosemary sprigs at Mrs. Farnham's feet. "I'll fetch him at once. The party's already dissolving into chaos." He hesitated, eyes tightening. Does anyone else know?" "Not yet," Miss Marple replied. "And perhaps that is for the best until the authorities arrive." Carroway nodded and hurried off. though his backward glance suggested both concern and something more guarded. Left alone with Alice, Miss Marple guided the trembling young woman to sit on a lower, stone ledge nearby. "Try to breathe slowly," she urged. "In through the nose, out through the mouth. Shock is dreadful, but it passes with a little steadiness." Alice nodded weakly, clutching her gloves until the seams strained. Her gaze drifted back to her aunt, as if searching for some sign that all of this was merely a misunderstanding. She was upset because of that awful letter. I should have stayed with her. She asked me to. She expected me to. "Do not punish yourself," Miss Marple said firmly. "It is natural to think of what one might have done, but such thoughts offer no comfort and no truth. Your aunt was troubled when she received the letter, yes, but it does not follow that the letter alone is responsible for what happened." She allowed a thoughtful pause. "Yet I do think its arrival was no coincidence." The breeze shifted, carrying the faintest trace of something sharp. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the overturned teacup. It lay just beside the bench, its rim stained faintly with a residue that did not match ordinary tea. She said nothing aloud. There would be time later for careful inquiry. Some minutes passed before the constable arrived. Constable Greaves, a stout man with an earnest expression and a tendency to look overwhelmed whenever events strayed from traffic fines or missing chickens. He approached with his notebook clutched in one hand and his cap askew from haste. "Miss Marple," he said with a respectful nod before turning to the body. "Dear heavens! Mrs. Farnham, are you certain she's—" "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "I'm afraid there is no doubt." Greaves swallowed visibly and knelt awkwardly beside the body, scribbling notes with trembling fingers. "Was she alone when it happened?" Alice shook her head helplessly. "I don't know. She came out here for some air. I thought she only needed a moment." Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice calm and steady. "Constable, I believe you will find that Mrs. Farnham took tea shortly before her death. It would be wise to secure the cup and its contents." Greaves blinked. "Do you suspect—" "I suspect nothing," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "But experience has taught me that sudden deaths following distress are rarely without cause. Best to be thorough." Greaves nodded earnestly and wrapped the teacup carefully in his handkerchief. "I'll take this back for examination. It's likely just a fainting spell or heart trouble, but we mustn't rule anything out." "Quite right," Miss Marple replied. As the constable continued his examination, Mr. Pritchard emerged from the hedge path, his face pale and strained. His gaze landed on the scene, and Miss Marple observed a flicker. Shock, yes, but not entirely unexpected shock. More like dread meeting its confirmation. "She's gone," he whispered, stepping back as though afraid to draw nearer. "Mrs. Farnham, dead?" Alice nodded miserably. Pritchard pressed a hand to his mouth, his other trembling at his side. "But surely it wasn't. I mean, the letter—" Miss Marple's head tilted slightly. "Yes, Mr. Pritchard. The letter. A troubling coincidence, is it not?" Pritchard's eyes darted toward the crushed paper still in Mrs. Farnham's hand. "I should sit down," he murmured, lowering himself onto a nearby stone border. "This is dreadful. Simply dreadful." Miss Marple watched him for several seconds longer, noting the perspiration beading at his temple, the rapid rise and fall of his chest, the way his gaze flitted around the garden as though expecting someone or something to emerge. Then, faintly, from the direction of the house, came the rising murmur of alarmed voices. News, it seemed, was beginning to spread, and with news would come rumors, fear, and the beginnings of suspicion. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly before her. She had seen such storms in small villages before, storms that revealed more than they concealed, and she suspected this one was only just beginning. The murmurs from the house grew louder, and soon figures began appearing along the garden path. hesitant at first, then bold as the grim news solidified in their minds. Miss Marple understood too well how such gatherings shifted. Shock gave way to curiosity, curiosity to speculation, and speculation to a collective scrutiny that rarely landed where it ought. Constable Greaves attempted, with limited success, to hold back the onlookers, waving his arms and insisting the area remain undisturbed. Mrs. Danforth clutched her violin case as if it might shield her from tragedy, while Mrs. Blackwell's lips worked furiously, shaped by questions she knew better than to voice openly. Miss Marple watched the unfolding commotion with that mild, unblinking attention which often gave her more information than questioning ever could. She noticed how eyes flicked not only to the lifeless figure on the bench, but to Mr. Pritchard, who sat trembling, and to Alice, whose distress lent her an air of wounded fragility. Above all, she noticed how quickly the villagers searched one another's expressions, as if the author of those letters might be betrayed by a guilty twitch or the refusal to meet a gaze. Alice rose unsteadily, leaning on Miss Marple's arm. Though her tears had subsided, her shock had settled into a quieter, colder fear. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "do you think someone meant to harm her because of that letter? Could the accusations? Could any of them be true?" Miss Marple guided her gently away from the gathering crowd, allowing Constable Greaves to busy himself with stern, disorganized instructions. "Letters of malice," she said softly, "are rarely born of truth, my dear. They come from envy, resentment, or the peculiar pleasure some individuals take in causing distress. But when cruelty is followed by sudden death, one must look at the connection with care." Alice shuddered. She said the accusations were vile. She didn't even want me to hear them. And now she's gone, and I can't help but think someone hated her enough to do this. Miss Marple gave her arm a gentle squeeze. Hatred is a strong word, but grudges can fester quietly for years. I wonder, though, why both she and Mr. Pritchard received letters at the same time. Such coordination suggests purpose, not impulse. She let her eyes drift once more toward Mr. Pritchard, who had not risen from the stone border. His gaze remained unfocused, as though he feared the world might shift further if he so much as blinked. Philip Carroway reappeared from the house, his expression tight as he approached. He bowed his head respectfully toward Alice, but addressed Miss Marple with a certain clipped urgency. "I've spoken to the rector. He's calming the guests, but rumors are already spreading faster than I can contain them. Some believe she collapsed from shock. Others are whispering about poison. For heaven's sake, do we even know what happened?" Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "We know only that she died shortly after receiving a letter designed to upset her greatly, and after drinking tea that was not, I believe, prepared by her own hand. The constable will examine the cup. Until then, we must avoid presuming too much." Carroway ran a hand through his hair, glancing uneasily at the teacup now wrapped in Greaves' handkerchief. "You don't think this was some sort of intentional act?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she looked toward the table where the refreshment still sat, untouched in the aftermath. "Tell me, Mr. Carroway," she said gently, "who poured the tea?" He blinked at her, unprepared for the question. "I'm not certain. There were several servants assisting. Mrs. Farnham was speaking with guests before she went inside. I suppose anyone might have poured it for her." Miss Marple nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on his face long enough for him to shift uncomfortably. "Thank you," she said, as though he had confirmed something. Meanwhile, Mrs. Blackwell managed to edge closer despite Greaves's warning gestures. "I never imagined such tragedy in St. Mildred's," she said in a hushed tone to Miss Marple. "One hears stories, of course, but to think someone among us might be responsible." Miss Marple offered her a sympathetic smile. Fear often stretches possibilities farther than prudence allows. Still, it is wise to remain observant. Mrs. Blackwell's eyes shone with a mixture of dread and fascination. "Observant, yes. Though I confess, Miss Marple, It unsettles me terribly that whoever wrote those letters has not revealed themselves. To target Lavinia and poor Mr. Pritchard, quite deliberate, if you ask me." Miss Marple did not contradict her, but her gaze followed the direction of Mrs. Blackwell's glance. Mr. Pritchard was wiping his brow with a trembling hand. The letter he had received lay on the ground beside him, half crumpled. Miss Marple approached him quietly. "Mr. Pritchard, forgive the intrusion, but may I ask, does your letter bear any resemblance to Mrs. Farnham's?" He flinched slightly, then nodded. "Yes. Anonymous. Cruel. Lies, of course. Everyone has petty enemies, but this goes beyond pettiness." His hand shook as he picked up the letter. It said things meant to ruin me, things no decent person would put to paper. Miss Marple studied him gently. And yet someone did. Two someones, or one very determined one. He glanced around nervously. Who would dare? Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Someone who knows this village as well as you do. Perhaps better." And with that, she let the silence settle, watching carefully as the weight of her words pressed upon him, searching his face for the flicker that might reveal far more than he intended. The corridor seemed to stretch longer than it had moments ago, as though the building itself were subtly shifting in response to their presence. Mara kept her flashlight angled low, sweeping over the scuffed tiles while Elias trailed a step behind, scribbling hurried notes even as he tried to keep pace. The echo of their footsteps felt heavier now, almost muffled, as if the walls absorbed every sound but the soft pulse of air moving somewhere ahead of them. Mara paused when she noticed a faint, metallic scent drifting from the far end of the hall, something that reminded her of wet iron and old dust. It wasn't strong, but it was distinct enough to make her tighten her grip on the flashlight. Elias noticed the change in her posture and stopped writing, lifting his head just enough to follow her line of sight before leaning closer. "Is that coming from the lab?" he whispered, and Mara gave a tense nod. The lab had been sealed off for years, or so the caretaker claimed, but the faint gleam of light slipping through the cracked door suggested otherwise. As they approached, the metallic smell intensified, and Mara felt the prickling sensation of static crawling along her arms. She reached out slowly, pushing the door open with the edge of her sleeve. The hinges groaned softly. Inside, scattered papers lay across the floor, each covered in blackened scribbles that looked more burned than written. Equipment that should have been coated in dust had been wiped clean, leaving streaks across the metal surfaces. The room felt recently disturbed, though no footprints marked the dusty areas beyond the central workspace. Elias stepped in, drawn immediately to a stack of notebooks arranged as if someone had sorted them minutes before. Mara scanned the corners first, checking every shadow before joining him. He opened the top notebook cautiously, revealing precise diagrams of symbols they had seen only once before, etched into the ground outside the old greenhouse. Something about the repetition of those shapes made Mara's stomach tighten. The diagrams were too deliberate, too perfect to belong to the erratic researcher who had vanished a decade earlier. Elias flipped another page, freezing when he noticed a line of fresh ink. The handwriting matched the researcher's according to the samples they had reviewed earlier, but the date scribbled above it was from 3 nights ago. Mara felt a chill trace her spine. This doesn't make sense. The caretaker said no one's been in here since the investigation closed. Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed to a smear near the margin of the page, a faint streak of the same metallic substance they had smelled in the hallway. He touched it lightly with his pen's tip, watching as it clung to the metal in a thin filament. "Whatever this is, it's reactive," he murmured. "Not blood. Not rust either." Before they could examine it further, a soft rhythmic tapping echoed from somewhere above them, like someone drumming their fingers on a pipe. Mara instinctively motioned for silence, her gaze shifting to the ceiling. The tapping paused, then resumed in a different cadence, traveling along the ventilation shafts. Elias snapped the notebook shut quietly, and they backed toward the door. The tapping grew louder, then abruptly stopped as though whoever, or whatever, had been moving suddenly realized they were listening. Mara stepped into the hallway first, scanning both directions. The air felt heavier now, humming faintly with the same energy she had sensed earlier. Elias closed the lab door behind them, making sure not to let it latch fully, just in case they needed to slip back in quickly. They moved further down the hall, following the direction the tapping had traveled. The corridor curved slightly, leading to the stairwell. A faint vibration ran through the metal handrail when Mara touched it, pulsing like a heartbeat. Elias noticed her reaction and reached toward it himself, recoiling when he felt the same strange rhythm. "Something's been moving through the ducts," he whispered, "and it's heading upward." The staircase felt colder as they ascended, their footsteps muted by the thick layer of dust coating each step. Halfway up, Mara paused again, hearing a faint rustle from the landing above. She signaled Elias to wait while she crept forward, each step slow and deliberate. When she reached the top, she found a door slightly ajar, leading to the old observatory room. A thin sliver of light spilled through, trembling as though disturbed by a breeze. Mara pushed the door open gently and stepped inside. The room smelled of old wood and forgotten nights, but beneath it lingered that same metallic scent. Something gleamed near the central table. A small brass key, still warm when she picked it up. When Elias joined her, she dropped the key onto his palm. "Whatever we're chasing," she said quietly, "it wants us to follow, and it's leading us somewhere we're not supposed to go." Mara exchanged a tense glance with Elias, sensing the fragile threshold they were about to cross, yet neither hesitated as the room's silence deepened around them. Mara closed her fingers around the warm brass key again, feeling the lingering heat radiating through her palm as though it held some echo of the hand that had left it behind. Elias stood close beside her, his breathing shallow and barely audible in the stillness of the observatory. Dust circled gently in the dim column of moonlight that spilled through the narrow window, and every shifting mote seemed to pulse with the same strange rhythm they'd felt in the staircase railing. Mara's instincts sharpened, threading the connection between these subtle disturbances. None dramatic on their own, yet unmistakably intentional when viewed together. She stepped farther into the room, her eyes moving over the warped wooden boards, the abandoned telescope frame, and the faint trails in the dust that suggested someone had paced restlessly there, back and forth, in tight, nervous arcs. Elias crouched near the table where the key had been found, examining the thin grooves etched into the surface, as though someone had dragged the edge of a metal tool repeatedly across the grain. "It wasn't here long," he murmured. "The dust doesn't settle this evenly after much time. And look, there's a ridge of displaced debris along the edge, like something was pushed aside in a hurry." Mara followed his line of sight. A short distance from the table's corner, a rectangular imprint disrupted the dust. A book-sized void, sharply outlined. She crouched beside it, brushing a fingertip lightly along the clean space. Something was here recently. Something important enough to take with them. Important enough to leave a key behind instead, Elias added, rising with a soft groan. "But why leave us anything at all? It's like they want us just a step behind." Mara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked toward the far wall where the faintest scraping sound reached her ears. She pressed her hand against the aged plaster, feeling a subtle vibration humming beneath it, like a soft, steady pulse that didn't belong to any natural structure. The air near the wall felt warmer, as if an unseen current flowed just behind its surface. Elias joined her, touching the wall briefly and pulling his hand back with a startled hiss. "It's heated, not burning, but definitely warm. Something's operating behind there." Mara stepped back, studying the positioning of the wall and the adjoining rooms they'd passed earlier. Behind this should be the abandoned records room, but the caretaker swore the entire wing was sealed years ago. Clearly he was misinformed, or lying. Elias reached for the doorknob of the adjoining hallway door, but Mara stopped him with a gentle hand on his arm. Her expression was calm, but firm. "Not yet. Whoever moved through here is still close. If we corner them too soon, we might lose what they're trying to reveal." Elias looked frustrated, but he nodded. Mara's approach had always been deliberate, precise, grounded in the small details most investigators overlooked. And every instinct in him told him she was right. He tucked the notebook he carried back under his arm and waited for her next step. Mara crossed to the observatory once more, scanning for anything they might have missed. Her eyes paused on the floor beneath the window, a faint trail of scratches leading toward the outer wall. She knelt, following the pattern with careful attention. "These weren't made by boots," she murmured. "Too shallow, too uniform. More like metal dragging lightly over the surface." Her gaze drifted upward to the window latch, where a small strip of cloth was caught on the hinge, a dark, tightly woven fabric, torn at the edge as though ripped by someone climbing out in haste. Elias followed her focus. "So they didn't go back the way we came." "No," Mara said softly. "They climbed out, but the drop on the other side—" She crossed to the window and peered out. The ground lay far below, muted in the bluish night hue, with only a narrow ledge running along the stone wall. Elias leaned beside her and whistled under his breath. "Risky. They'd need balance, or desperation, or familiarity," Mara added. "Someone who knows these structures well enough not to slip. Someone who's moved through these upper floors before." They both fell silent, considering the implication. Whoever they were following knew the building intimately, knew where to step, which passages pulsed with hidden warmth, and which forgotten rooms held secrets worth revisiting. Mara pulled back from the window and let her mind turn over the connection between the torn cloth, the heated wall, and the missing object from the table. "Let's return to the hallway," she said quietly. "If they climbed out, they might try to re-enter through a lower floor, and if we move quickly, we can catch the direction of that tapping before it fades." Elias didn't need more convincing. They left the observatory, and as Mara closed the door behind them, her eyes drifted once more to the brass key in her hand. It seemed heavier now, weighted with implication. The corridor outside felt colder than before, and the faint metallic scent trailed along its length like a beckoning thread. They moved swiftly, but not hurriedly, listening for any trace of sound. When they reached the bottom of the staircase, Mara paused, tilting her head. A faint, deliberate click echoed from somewhere ahead. A door closing softly, but not cautiously enough to avoid notice. Elias stiffened, glancing to her. Mara's voice was little more than a breath. "We're closer than they want us to be." And with that, they stepped forward into the deepening tension. Mara followed the direction of the soft click with deliberate calm, letting her senses adjust to the shifting air of the hallway. The faint scent of metal still lingered, but it was joined now by something subtler. Dust that had been stirred recently, the soft, nearly imperceptible tremor of vibrations moving through the floorboards beneath their feet. Elias stayed close enough that she could hear the controlled rhythm of his breathing, though she knew he was fighting the urge to rush ahead. Instead, he mirrored her pace, trusting her ability to read the details he might miss. The hall narrowed as they continued, the overhead lights dead or long removed, leaving only the weak glow of Mara's flashlight to illuminate the peeling paint and aged wooden trim. Occasionally, the beam caught fragments of old posters or notices pinned to the walls, their messages faded into illegibility. The silence pressed against them, interrupted only by the distant hum that had been following them since the lab. Mara slowed near a branching corridor, tilting her head. The hum was louder here. Not merely a vibration, but a layered resonance, like multiple tones overlapping in imperfect harmony. She raised her hand for Elias to stop. He did, leaning slightly to listen. "Is that coming from the records wing?" he whispered. Mara nodded. "Behind the sealed doors. It's stronger now." Elias frowned. "But if it's sealed, How is anything operating in there? Someone reopened it, Mara said softly. And recently, they're using it. She directed her flashlight along the floor, tracing the faint outline of drag marks that curved toward the sealed wing. The marks were subtle, shallow grooves disturbed in the dust, but they formed a clear path. Someone had hauled something heavy, carefully but not perfectly precise. It leads straight to the archives, she murmured. Whatever they took from the observatory. Elias finished her thought. They brought it here. They exchanged a look, and without further debate, followed the trail. At the end of the corridor loomed a pair of tall double doors, the kind that once opened into staff-only areas. Chains lay coiled at their base. Elias crouched, lifting them. "Cut clean through," he said, holding up one of the broken links. Mara touched the metal and felt the warmth again, faint but undeniable. "This was done hours ago," she murmured. "Not days. Not weeks." She pushed one of the heavy doors gently. It shifted inward with minimal resistance, creaking softly but not loudly enough to alert anyone too far inside. The temperature beyond the doorway was noticeably warmer, and the hum reached them with more clarity. Elias stepped through behind Mara, blinking as his eyes adjusted to a line of faint orange lights running along the upper corners of the walls. "Emergency power?" he asked. "Or jury-rigged lighting," Mara suggested. Someone wanted visibility here, but not enough to draw attention from the outside. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with steel doors labeled in flaking paint. Archives A, Archives B, restricted storage. Mara's flashlight swept over each door until it stopped on the one slightly ajar. A thin strip of warm light spilled through the opening, pulsing faintly in rhythm with the hum. Elias swallowed. "That has to be it." "Yes," Mara said. "But we approach slowly." She moved closer, her footsteps soundless on the dusty floor. When she reached the door, she paused, listening. The hum shifted slightly, like a tone adjusting to account for new movement. Mara held her breath and waited. After several seconds, the sound stabilized again. Elias leaned forward. "Do you think they heard us?" "If they did, they didn't react," Mara whispered. She pushed the door gently, widening the gap just enough to slip inside. The room was long and rectangular, filled with towering shelves that cast sharp shadows against the floor. A single desk lamp sat at the far end, its warm glow illuminating a cluttered workspace. Papers were strewn across the table, alongside open containers of chemicals, metal tools, and a large, irregularly shaped object wrapped in dark cloth, the missing item from the observatory. Elias's breath caught. "There it is." Mara crossed the room swiftly but silently, keeping her senses attuned to the far corners. The hum was deafeningly close here, vibrating through the floor, the shelves, the air itself. It seemed to emanate from beneath the desk, from some hidden apparatus operating just out of view. She lifted the edge of the cloth, revealing a large, disc-shaped object covered in etched symbols, identical to those in the lab notebooks, but more intricate, more deliberate. The metal was warm to the touch. Elias stared, horrified and fascinated. It's not just a diagram. It's real." "And active," Mara said. "Look." The symbols glowed faintly, pulsing with each wave of the hum. Elias opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden shift of air behind them made Mara spin instantly. A shadow moved between the shelves, retreating just beyond the edge of the lamp's glow. Elias froze. Mara stepped forward, voice low but steady. "We know you're here, and we know what you took." Silence, then a whisper, ragged, breathless, from the darkness. "You shouldn't have followed." Elias tensed, but Mara remained still, her gaze steady as the shadow shifted again, this time closer, no longer trying to hide, but watching with a kind of desperate intensity. "We didn't follow out of curiosity," Mara said softly. We followed because you're running out of places to hide." The shadow trembled. Then, slowly, it stepped into the dim light, revealing the outline of a figure they had not expected to see. And for the first time that night, Elias truly understood the meaning of fear. The figure stepped fully into the dim glow of the desk lamp, and for a moment, neither Mara nor Elias could speak. The man standing before them was gaunt, his face drawn and hollow, as though he had not seen natural sunlight in months. His clothes were disheveled, sleeves frayed, and one of his hands trembled violently as he steadied himself against a shelf. But it wasn't his physical state that froze Elias in place. It was his identity. Mara recognized him instantly as well, though she hid her reaction with practiced control. "Dr. Harland Fisk," she said quietly, her voice steady but carrying all the weight of revelation. "You were declared dead 10 years ago." Harland let out a brittle, humorless laugh. "Dead, yes, a convenient label, one that allowed certain people to forget what they forced me to discover." Elias's throat tightened. He had studied the case files for months. Harland Fisk, the brilliant yet unstable researcher whose disappearance had ended the controversial energy project that once consumed this facility. Official records claimed he'd had a breakdown. Others whispered that he'd fled after conducting unauthorized experiments. But no one expected to find him alive, let alone here. Mara kept her gaze pinned on him, noting each flicker across his features. "You've been living inside this building," she said, less a question, more a deduction. "Using passages no one else remembers, moving through spaces everyone assumed were abandoned." Harlan's eyes darted toward the humming device beneath the desk. "I had to continue my work. They wanted to shut it down, bury it under bureaucracy and fear. They didn't understand what this could do." Elias swallowed, forcing his voice to remain calm. "What exactly have you activated? We can feel its resonance in every wall." Harlan stepped closer to the table, his hand hovering protectively over the cloth-covered object. "Not activated. Reactivated. You have no idea what's been slumbering beneath this place." His voice thinned, almost reverent. "It draws from frequencies older than our own sciences. Patterns hidden beneath the noise of the world." Mara approached cautiously, stopping a measured distance from him. "You left the key. You led us here." He hesitated, and in that hesitation Mara saw the truth. He wasn't sure whether he had done it deliberately. His gaze unfocused for a moment, as though he were listening to something only he could hear. "The key," he murmured. "I thought I put it away. I thought I had more time." Elias exchanged a quick glance with Mara. Something about Harlan's manner suggested he was not entirely in command of himself, or perhaps not entirely alone in his own thoughts. Mara softened her tone. "Why come out now? After all these years?" Harlan's expression contorted into something between grief and dread. "Because the machine is waking up too quickly. It shouldn't have been this strong yet. Something accelerated it. Something external, and when it wakes fully..." His voice broke. "You felt the vibrations. The heat. It's only the beginning." Elias stepped closer despite his fear. "Then shut it down." Harlan shook his head violently. "I can't. Not the way it is now. The patterns have imprinted themselves, feeding off the smallest resonance. Every footstep, every breath in this building strengthens the current." Mara looked at the pulsing symbols etched into the metal disc. "Then we'll have to separate the source from the conduit." Harlan froze. His eyes snapped toward her. "You understand? You really understand?" For a moment his face softened, gratitude mixing with the desperation. "But it's dangerous. If you break the connection without stabilizing the flow, the energy could rupture through the foundation." Elias's heart pounded. "Meaning?" Harlan stared at him with hollow intensity. "Meaning the entire structure could collapse." The hum intensified suddenly, rising in pitch as though provoked by their very presence. The floor vibrated beneath them. Loose papers fluttered. A shelf rattled violently before Mara steadied it with a swift hand. Harland backed away from the desk. It's responding again. It's aware of motion, aware of interference. Elias felt a chill run through him at the word aware. Harland, this device isn't sentient. It can't be. The older man's hollow laugh echoed faintly. Can't? Do you think I wanted to believe that? Do you think I wanted to spend 10 years trying to prove my own senses wrong? Mara stepped closer to Elias, lowering her voice. We need to gain control of the situation before the next pulse. It's increasing in intensity. Elias nodded shakily. And Harland? Mara watched the trembling man carefully. We need him. He's the only one who understands how this was built. As if in response, Harland suddenly pressed his hands to his temples, wincing. It's too loud now. Too strong, I can't. He staggered, nearly collapsing before Mara caught him by the arm. His skin burned hot beneath her touch. Harland, stay with us, she urged. Tell us what triggers the next surge. He looked up, eyes wide with terror. Sound, pressure, any sudden movement. It reacts to everything. The hum deepened again, this time accompanied by a low crack that echoed through the archives like a shifting tectonic plate. Elias tensed. We need a plan. Now. Mara placed a steady hand on Harland's shoulder, grounding him. You're going to show us exactly how to stop this. Slowly, carefully, before it decides to finish what you started. And as the room trembled around them, Harland gave a single, broken nod. Harland's nod seemed almost fragile under the weight of the pulsing vibrations that thrummed through the floor and walls, but Mara recognized the determination beneath it. She adjusted the beam of her flashlight, letting it sweep across the cluttered desk without losing sight of the glowing disk. The etched symbols throbbed in rhythm with the hum, their luminescence casting long, wavering shadows along the shelves, and each flicker reminded her how precarious their situation had become. Elias stood beside her, pale but focused, and Mara could feel the tension coiling in him like a spring ready to snap. She motioned toward the desk. Harland, we need the sequence. Show us, step by step, every lever, every dial, every connection that stabilizes it. Harland hesitated, then exhaled sharply, his body trembling from the effort of steadying his thoughts. The conduits are linked by feedback loops, he said, his fingers hovering over the edge of the disk. Break the loops incorrectly, and the flow surges uncontrollably. You will feel it in the floor first, then in the walls. It will escalate to catastrophic failure. His voice faltered for a second before firming again. You have to isolate each node individually, monitor the resonance, and then apply the dampening fields in sequence. One wrong step, and the structure itself will suffer. Mara leaned in, scanning the setup carefully. And the dampening fields? She asked. Where do we engage them? Harland's gaze flicked to a panel of aged switches along the far side of the desk, almost hidden in the shadows. Behind the false panel, there is a lever for each channel. Start with the largest node. It controls the base frequency, then the secondary nodes. He trailed off, swallowing hard. But you must move deliberately. Quick movements, abrupt changes in weight, even sudden noises. It reacts to them all. Elias took a cautious step toward the desk, glancing at the faintly glowing symbols. Harland, is there anything we can use to dampen the initial surge? Something that won't destabilize the sequence entirely? Harland's eyes widened. Yes, the calibration weights. They sit in the cabinet along the northern wall, heavy, flat metallic blocks. Place them gently on the nodes as indicated. They absorb and redirect resonance, but only if applied correctly. Mara moved toward the cabinet first, her flashlight illuminating a row of flat, rectangular blocks neatly stacked on shelves that had otherwise been undisturbed. She carefully lifted one, feeling the solid, almost comforting weight in her hands. Elias followed suit, and together they carried the blocks back to the desk. Mara placed the first on the largest node, aligning it according to the faintly etched guide Harland indicated. The hum shifted slightly, not increasing, not decreasing, merely adjusting like a cautious animal testing its surroundings. She felt the vibration in her feet, faint but unmistakable, and knew that the initial step had been successful. Harland's voice was taut with tension. Now the secondary nodes. Move with care. Apply the weights one at a time. Check the resonance before proceeding to the next. They followed the instructions methodically. Mara positioned a block on the second node while Elias monitored the subtle vibrations, noting the slight changes in pitch and intensity. They worked in silence, broken only by Harland's low, strained mutterings as he guided them. Steady. Yes, steady. Don't rush it. More to the right. Perfect. With each correctly placed weight, the hum's intensity seemed to ebb slightly, though the room still vibrated under their feet. It was as though the building itself were alive, aware of their adjustments and responding with a cautious cooperation. Suddenly, a sharp click echoed through the room. A door somewhere along the perimeter had moved. Mara froze, her heart leaping. Elias stiffened beside her, glancing toward the sound. Harland's eyes widened. No sudden disturbances. Not now. It cannot handle it. Mara raised a hand, signaling Elias to stay still. The sound repeated, a soft, deliberate shuffle, then silence. Whoever had entered, if anyone had, was cautious, knowing the vibrations could betray their position. Mara took a slow step toward the nearest shadowed corner, keeping her voice low. Harland, remain calm. Focus only on the sequence. He nodded, trembling, and returned his attention to the disc, muttering the necessary steps to ensure the flow remained stable. Elias checked the third node, the smallest of the three, adjusting the block placement minutely, his hands steady despite the tremor in his voice. The hum decreased slightly, the vibration becoming less threatening but still present, like a contained storm restrained only by their careful diligence. Mara noticed a subtle shift in Harland's posture. His shoulders sagged slightly, relief flickering across his face. The immediate danger had not passed, but their controlled adjustments had bought them precious moments. Then, as they moved to the final node, a loud crash reverberated from the far side of the room. Papers flew into the air, some landing near the glowing disc. Mara and Elias turned sharply. A shadow shifted again, moving swiftly across the floor. Someone was attempting to interfere. Mara's pulse quickened, but she did not panic. Harland, the final weight, she instructed firmly. We finish this sequence now. Harland nodded, guiding them in rapid yet precise motions. The final weight settled onto the last node. The hum pulsed one final, drawn-out vibration, and then began to decrease, fading into a low, steady hum that no longer shook the floor beneath them. Mara exhaled slowly, allowing herself the first sense of calm since they had entered the archives. Elias loosened his grip on the flashlight, his shoulders relaxing as the tension drained away. Harland sank into a chair, trembling but alive, his gaze fixed on the disc. It's stable, he whispered. For the moment, but the pattern remains active. It is not yet dormant. Mara stepped back, surveying the room and the intricate array of symbols, weights, and devices that had been brought under control. Then we've bought time, she said softly. Time enough to understand and to prevent it from being used recklessly again. Harland nodded, still pale and exhausted, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. Elias glanced between Mara and the trembling researcher. We need to secure this place, he said, and make sure no one else can trigger it, accidentally or intentionally. Mara's gaze swept over the room, her mind already calculating the next steps, the chain of responsibility, and the hidden threats that still lingered, unseen in the shadows. For the first time since entering the building, Mara allowed herself a measured breath, sensing that the immediate danger had passed, though she knew the deeper mysteries had only just begun to unfold. The hum had diminished to a soft vibration that Mara could feel through her shoes more than hear with her ears, a reminder that the building itself had not returned entirely to stillness. Elias began carefully placing the remaining loose papers back onto the desk, ensuring that none of the symbols or notes would be accidentally disturbed. Mara's eyes, however, were already sweeping the room, absorbing the small details that might reveal hidden truths. Harland slumped further in his chair, exhaustion written across his lined face, but his gaze remained fixed on the pulsing disc, his hands trembling slightly as if the effort to stabilize it had drained not only his strength but also his very composure. Mara approached him quietly, lowering her voice so as not to disturb the delicate balance they had achieved. "Harland," she said gently, "we need to understand the nature of this pattern before it can awaken again. Tell us everything you know about the conduits, the nodes, and the reason these sequences exist." Harland let out a ragged breath, his chest rising and falling unevenly. "It's not simply energy," he began, his voice tight with a mix of fear and awe. "It's a resonance, a series of frequencies that, when aligned correctly, can amplify thought and intention. But it's dangerous. The sequences must be precise. One misalignment, one unaccounted variable, and it destabilizes everything, sending shockwaves not just through this structure, but potentially far beyond." Elias froze, glancing at Mara with wide eyes. "Shockwaves? Beyond the building?" "Yes," Harland said, his voice quivering. "The energy is connected to ambient resonance. It can travel through metal, through the ground, through water, subtle at first, then growing exponentially if unchecked." He gestured toward the disk, where the symbols now shimmered faintly, like a heartbeat slowing after exertion. "I've kept it contained here, in isolation, for a decade. I thought it safe, but someone reopened the sequence and it accelerated beyond my calculations." Mara's mind raced. "Who reopened it?" she asked, though she suspected the answer. "You said someone external. You must know something about them." Harland's hands trembled as he rubbed them over his face. "I didn't see them clearly. Shadows, movements. I tried to remain hidden while they manipulated the conduits. Whoever they are, they know more about the system than I do. That's what terrifies me." Elias swallowed hard. "Then we need to secure the building, and quickly, before anyone else can attempt the sequence. Or make a mistake." Mara nodded, her attention returning to the network of shelves, the desk, and the faintly glowing disc. "We'll need to disable access points, monitor the environment, and perhaps call for assistance. But we must keep this contained in the meantime." She looked at Harland. "You'll guide us, slowly, step by step. Every detail matters." Harland inclined his head, his pale lips tightening. "Very well," he said, voice fragile but steadying. "The first step is ensuring the nodes cannot be tampered with externally. Locks, dampening weights, and covers must be restored in sequence. Remove one prematurely, and the resonance may spike again." His eyes darted toward the faint shadows in the corner of the room. "We must assume someone may still be watching, or waiting." Mara moved toward the nearest set of shelves and began organizing the tools, blocks, and papers into neat, accessible sections. Elias assisted, carrying some of the heavier weights to the base of the desk. As they worked, Mara continued to observe Harland, noting the subtle cues of his anxiety, the tightening of his jaw, the restless shifting of his eyes, the small stutter in his gestures. Each told her more about the man's state than his words ever could, revealing both his brilliance and his fragility. She realized that controlling the pattern would require not only precision, but also psychological composure, something that could falter if fear was allowed to dominate. Harland began instructing them in the restoration sequence, each step meticulous and exact. Mara followed methodically, ensuring each weight was replaced, each switch reset to its correct alignment, and each conduit properly covered. Elias checked the floor for vibrations, tapping gently with his fingertips, noting the subtle variations in hum as they progressed. The room seemed to breathe with them, alive in a muted, resonant way that Mara found both unnerving and strangely captivating. The symbols on the disc shimmered faintly in time with the room's pulse, as if approving their careful ministrations. A sudden creak echoed from the far doorway, causing Mara to glance toward the shadows. For a fleeting moment, she thought someone had returned. She tightened her grip on a weight, ready to respond if necessary. But the hall beyond remained silent, only the low, steady hum continuing in time with their movements. "Someone or something else is out there," she murmured to Elias, her tone calm but alert. "We proceed, but remain cautious. Any abrupt action could provoke them, or provoke the pattern itself." Harland nodded, his focus unwavering on the disc as he guided them through the final steps. The last weight was replaced, the switches returned to their correct positions, and the conduit covers secured. The hum gradually softened to a steady, almost imperceptible vibration, more comforting than threatening. Mara took a slow breath, her senses still alert but relieved. She looked at Harland, whose gaunt face now carried a faint expression of astonished gratitude. "It is contained," he whispered, "for now." Elias let out a breath he had been holding, straightening his shoulders. "Then we have time. But we need to understand what triggered the acceleration in the first place and prevent it from happening again." Mara's gaze swept the room once more, noting the faint scratches along the floor, the shadows that lingered at the corners, and the subtle warmth still emanating from the disc. "Yes," she said softly, "and we must remain vigilant. Whoever, or whatever moved here, has plans we cannot yet see. Our task is only beginning." Harland lowered his hands to his lap, finally allowing himself a moment of rest, though the tension in his body remained. Mara stepped beside Elias, both of them silently contemplating the implications of what they had witnessed, understanding that the stability they had achieved was temporary and fragile, yet critical. Outside the room, the building waited in silence, holding its secrets and its unseen watchers, as the three of them began the painstaking work of untangling the true nature of the device and the dangers it concealed, lying dormant but never entirely neutralized. Mara stood in the dimly lit archives, surveying the scene with a calm that belied the storm of activity that had just unfolded. The hum of the disc had settled into a near imperceptible vibration, but the room remained tense, as though the very walls held their breath. Harland slumped further into the chair, exhausted but seemingly relieved, his eyes darting to Mara, as if searching for permission to relax entirely. Elias moved quietly around the room, inspecting the weights, the switches, and the conduit covers to ensure everything remained in perfect alignment. Mara's mind, however, was already turning over the strands of evidence, each detail now fitting into a clearer picture. "Harland," she said softly, stepping closer, "we need to understand exactly how this came to be tampered with in the first place. Only then can we ensure it doesn't happen again." He nodded, rubbing his hands over his face. I should have suspected something months ago. After the papers disappeared from the observatory, the subtle vibrations I'd begun noticing in the air should have warned me. But I convinced myself it was the building settling, or perhaps a malfunction in the old equipment. Whoever returned here knew the system intimately. They knew the sequence, or at least the gaps I had overlooked. Elias, still kneeling beside one of the nodes, straightened and looked up. "So this wasn't an accident. Someone deliberately reactivated the sequence to exploit it?" Harland's gaze darkened. "Yes, and they left subtle signs. Traces meant for someone to follow, perhaps, but clever enough to mislead any casual observer. The key in the observatory, the faint drag marks, the patterns in the dust. It was a breadcrumb trail, either to guide an ally or to lure me, or whoever else, into a trap. Mara's sharp eyes flicked around the room, noting the small anomalies. The irregular scratches along the floor, the slightly displaced papers, the subtle scorch marks on the metal edges of the desk. Each of these details had seemed minor at first, yet in retrospect, they formed a narrative, one of deliberate intrusion, observation, and misdirection. "Who else had access to the building after it was declared closed?" she asked. Harland shook his head. "The caretaker, and a few auditors during inspections, but none should have known the sequences well enough to manipulate them. Only someone who had worked on the project itself, or studied my notes extensively, could have managed it." Mara's lips pressed together thoughtfully. "We need to consider motive, not just capability. Who benefits from destabilizing the device, even temporarily?" Her eyes flicked to Elias. "And who would go to such lengths to ensure it was reactivated while keeping the room contained, yet leaving enough clues for us to find it?" Elias's brow furrowed. "Could it be someone trying to finish what you started, Harland? Or someone hoping to replicate it?" Harland's hands shook slightly. "Possibly. But they misjudged the balance, underestimated the feedback. That's why I noticed the acceleration, and that's why the sequence nearly became uncontrollable." Mara crouched beside the glowing disk, careful to avoid touching the warm metal. She examined the arrangement of the symbols, the placement of the weights, and the subtle differences between the etched patterns and the original diagrams in the notebooks. "Look here," she said, pointing. "Notice the slight asymmetry in this section. Someone tried to adjust the resonance manually, rather than following the true sequence. They left a mark just visible enough for someone observant to notice." She looked at Harland. "You didn't make this adjustment. This was done deliberately, incorrectly, by someone hoping the system would fail in a controlled way, or at least they believed they could control it." Harland leaned closer, his pale face drawn tight with concern. "You're saying they intended a near catastrophe?" "Yes," Mara said softly, "but it wasn't to destroy. It was a test to see if the system would respond, predictably, and to gauge your methods. Whoever did this knew enough to create danger, but not enough to complete the sequence safely." She rose, turning toward him. "Now, can you identify the culprit?" He hesitated, then slowly nodded. "There is only one person. Someone I never expected. One of the auditors assigned during the last inspection. Quiet, observant, seemingly deferential, but their curiosity was obsessive. They studied my notes, traced every movement, and finally found the courage to enter these spaces themselves. Only they could have left the marks and nearly completed the sequence." Mara's expression remained calm, her mind cataloguing the subtle behaviors she had noted in the village's recent interactions, the small inconsistencies, the overly careful phrasing, the peculiar interest in reports she hadn't yet read. Everything aligned. Then the trail is clear. This person acted alone, yet with precise knowledge, driven by obsession and ambition. They expected the sequence to be beyond control, to draw attention and test both the device and your response. But they miscalculated. That's why the pattern surged prematurely. Harland exhaled shakily, relief mingled with lingering fear. I see it now. They underestimated me. They underestimated the system." Mara nodded. "And now it's contained. For the moment, the building is safe and the sequence neutralized. The key, the disks, and the weights can be secured. And we know who manipulated it, why they did it, and how to prevent future attempts." Elias glanced around the archives. "Still alert? And what about the shadow we thought we saw earlier? Could it have been them retreating?" Mara smiled faintly, a touch of wry satisfaction in her eyes. "Yes. They were clever enough to watch and withdraw when they realized we were too close. But cleverness has limits. The evidence points directly to them, and now we have the narrative to expose their actions without risking the device." Harland finally allowed himself to slump fully in his chair, exhausted but grateful. Mara regarded both him and Elias, the calm of her demeanor a stark contrast to the tension of the past hour. She spoke softly, her voice carrying the finality of her deduction. The pattern is safe, the threat neutralized, and the person responsible has left a trail that ensures they cannot escape accountability. Outside, the building remained silent, yet Mara could feel the echoes of its hidden potential lingering, dormant for now. Elias looked at her with quiet awe. "You're incredible," he said, barely above a whisper. Mara shook her head gently. "Not incredible. Observant, patient. The truth often lies in the smallest details, waiting for someone to notice." Harlan's gaze followed hers, and he finally allowed a hint of a smile. "Then perhaps there is hope for this knowledge. Controlled, contained, and understood." Mara turned toward the shadows of the room, her mind cataloguing each nuance, each human reaction, each subtle deception. The mystery was solved, the danger averted, but the lessons remained clear. Curiosity, ambition, and obsession could awaken forces few could control. But with careful observation and steady reasoning, even the most complex pattern could be untangled. And with that thought, Mara allowed herself a final, measured breath. The calm after the storm settling across the archives as the three of them prepared to secure the building and the secrets it contained, ensuring that the poisoned pen of ambition could harm no one else.